And welcome to this edition of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. And Ray, you're just back from a big trip. Why don't you give us, in a nutshell, your experience?
Oh, I'd be glad to, Keith. I have. I've enjoyed a trip on the Mississippi River. I actually took the City of New Orleans train from Memphis down to New Orleans. A day of very relaxing travel, I might add. I'd never been on Amtrak before, but it worked out fine. And then I spent a day in the World War II Museum. Wow, was that really an amazing opportunity. And I talked with them about possibly exchanging traveling exhibits with Oak Ridge. By the way, they have a good display on the Manhattan Project. I was actually surprised to find how well it is done. But that's a huge museum and really doing well. Then I caught the American Heritage riverboat and went back up the Mississippi. It had a Civil War theme. So we stopped at Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, and Natchez and talked all about, or they gave excursions out to the battlegrounds and talked about that. And actually, Keith, the highlight of the trip for me was there was one day where we didn't have any excursions. We were just cruising up the river. And the person who was in charge of the tour learned that I was a historian for the city of Oak Ridge. And she asked me to make a presentation, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, gave me an hour. And as you know, I carry a thumb drive with me all the time. Todd, you understand that. So I gave the presentation that I normally give to people about the history of Oak Ridge. And we had the lounge was full of travelers. And as you know, not many of them can know much about Oak Ridge except they attach it to the atomic bomb, and that's about it. So we had a good question and answer session, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I recommend the American river cruises to anyone that's interested in, especially the history themes that go along these rivers. And the Mississippi River is a big river, yeah. But I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thanks for asking.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Well, we've got Dr. Ryder back with us today. I'm excited about this. Why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about what he's going to be doing for us?
I'll be glad to. I'm glad to have Todd here again. This is the second of his sessions on the German bombs and nuclear program. He introduced the idea to us, and he's done an enormous amount of research. Introduced the idea to us before, and he will bring us up on some more information about his research today. And we've already talked a bit about this. I'm going to go ahead and insert it now, and we'll mention it again at the end. But Todd would welcome questions. If you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook, and you have questions about what he's presenting, if you'll just put that in comments, I'll be looking for it. And we'll have him on later, and we will use those questions to get a question and answer session going. So obviously you can comment other ways. You can send an email or text, but if you'll just comment to the YouTube video or to the video, well, it'll be on the YouTube video regardless of where you look at it. So we'll use that to get questions. Todd, go ahead and start your presentation, and thanks for coming back again.
Oh, thank you both very much for inviting me back. It's great to be back. So let me start by acknowledging again all the various archives around the world that have helped with us. This would not have been possible without files from all around the world, and all the people around the world who have helped with this research. In particular, this time, I'd really like to acknowledge two people, Frank Dubert and Norberto La Huerta, who were the first researchers who found archival evidence of the true German H-bomb program. And I'll be presenting some of that. Also, just so the three of us do not get thrown into Guantanamo, let me point out from the very beginning that everything we're talking about here, all my slides, the book, everything is drawn purely from unclassified sources. So previously on As the Nerd Turns, we had talked about some of the evidence for the German fission bomb program. There's quite a bit of archival evidence that's been recently rediscovered that Germany was developing fission bombs during the war and may well have even tested them successfully during the war. What I want to talk about now is additional archival evidence that during the war, German and Austrian scientists were working on applications of fusion for bombs. And they were doing that in several different ways. So there's evidence that they developed fusion neutron generators using fusion fuel and high voltage. And those would be suitable for initiating a neutron chain reaction in a fission bomb. So a small fusion component for a fission bomb. The second way they appear to develop was putting a small amount of fusion fuel at the center of a fission implosion bomb. And that would not generate that much fusion energy, but it would generate a lot of neutrons. And those neutrons would aid the fission chain reaction and improve its efficiency and its explosive energy yield. So it's called fusion boosting. There's evidence the Germans were doing that. And then they developed, or were developing, an honest to goodness H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, that had a fission bomb as a trigger or primary. But then instead of developing a kiloton level explosion like a fission bomb, would have developed a megaton level explosion using solid storable lithium deuteride fusion fuel as the secondary, if you will. And then there's also evidence that after the war, many of the German and Austrian nuclear experts involved in this went to the US or to other countries and had a large impact on post-war programs there. So I'm going to run through all this very quickly, but for people who want to see it in more detail, these slides, far more information is on my website. So please stare at it for as long as you want afterward. And please do send in questions if anybody has any questions. So the first application of fusion and bombs in the German program was high voltage fusion neutron initiators. And this work began very early, so no later than 1928, a number of German scientists and Austrian scientists started studying how fusion works in stars. Fritz Hautermans in Germany, Georg Stetter in Austria. They continued this for several years during the 1930s. The physics of fusion in stars was ultimately fairly much polished off in Germany by Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. And then by Hans Bethe, who had started his career in Germany and then moved to the US, and of course most famously became the first head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos. But they moved from stars to terrestrial applications very quickly. So here was a patent from 1934 on how to do fusion on the Earth. And this was from a couple of guys, Arno Brasch and Fritz Lange, who were working at the German electric company AEG in Berlin. And this German name literally means General Electric. This was the German equivalent of General Electric, not affiliated with the US General Electric, but quite comparable to it. So a very large electrical electronics company with the resources to do research in any areas that they wanted. And here they were starting to get into fusion and creating fusion reactions if you apply enough voltage to fusion fuel. So here's the first patent on it in 1934. By 1938, there were two additional people there working on Hartmut Kalman and Ernst Kuhn. And so they filed this patent in 1938. They had perfected a nice little sealed tube that applied a high voltage to fusion fuel, such as lithium and deuterium, and would generate enough fusion reactions to produce very high energy neutrons. And those could be used as a neutron source. They were thinking about medical imaging and things initially, but later this seems to have also been used in bombs. So detailed information from them, and you'll see this AEG company pop up over and over. They seem to have been a major player in this German program on fusion bombs. So they developed those high voltage neutron generators, and then over the course of the war, those appear to have been mass produced and used for a number of applications in German science. So here are some examples I've pulled out of archives of built versions of these high voltage fusion neutron generators being used in different labs for different purposes. And then quite intriguingly, here is a post-war Allied interview of a professor in Europe who reported that in the latter stages of the war, the SS came around and started rounding up every high voltage fusion neutron generator they could find in German occupied Europe and confiscating them. And when they were asked why they needed all these, they said it was for new weapons that they were producing. So these were all rounded up and used by the SS. There's further evidence of that. So last time I showed you guys this report. This was from the Soviet general who was head of military intelligence, GRU, writing to Stalin in March 1945, giving a very detailed description from Soviet intelligence on what the German fission implosion bomb was like, its design, and also reporting it had been successfully tested multiple times. I won't drag you through all that again. I just want to point out that included in the detailed design he gave for the German bomb is specific mention of high voltage discharge tubes to produce neutrons. So that is repeated here several times in description, these high voltage fusion tubes to produce neutrons to initiate the reaction in this fission implosion bomb. It's described multiple times. Now, he also said that the fusion fuel was placed at the center of that bomb. So within the fission fuel will be surrounding that fusion fuel within that. And that means that potentially the fusion fuel could have been used for boosting purposes as well. That is described by a number of other sources. These were descriptions from Erich Schumann, one of the major designers of the German bomb. And he specifically showed the use of fusion fuel at the very center, then surrounded by fission fuel, and then surrounded by the conventional explosives used for the implosion process. So again, that fusion fuel at the center would not have generated much energy, but it would have generated neutrons, and those neutrons would have triggered more chain reactions in the fission fuel than otherwise would have happened. And so it would have increased the explosive yield of the fission fuel, potentially quite a lot with this fusion boosting. So this was described by Schumann, and he gave detailed descriptions of exactly what fusion fuels he was considering. He seems to have been especially fond of deuterium and lithium. You see this trend over and over, this theme of deuterium and lithium in all this German work. Schumann was working with Kurt Diebner during the war. After the war, Kurt Diebner also blabbed and showed these designs with fusion fuel at the center, surrounded by fission fuel. Kurt Diebner was a little hardcore. His fusion fuel of preference was deuterium tritium that he indicated here in this document. And then Kurt Diebner filed his own patents after the war, and these appear to have been based on wartime work. And that Russian intelligence report that I showed you, if I understand it correctly, seems to say that at the center of the German bomb was fusion fuel that was activated by high voltage. So it served as a neutron initiator with high voltage. And by being fusion fuel at the center of the bomb, it served for fusion boosting, if I understand that correctly. So this post-war patent from Kurt Diebner, who again was involved with the wartime bomb program, appears to show precisely that. It shows a central compartment for an implosion bomb. And in this central compartment is deuterium, tritium, and lithium fusion fuel. It applies a high voltage, and then the neutrons are available to everything around that, including any fission fuel during the implosion process. So this is the design, of course, of the US version of an implosion bomb, so the Gadget and Fat Man design. But there is enough detailed evidence from these German sources to put the German fission bomb design right alongside the US design. In general, they're quite similar, but there are a few key differences. So for the US bomb, the first US bombs used a neutron initiator that was fairly primitive. It was called the Urchin. It had beryllium and polonium in it to generate neutrons. In contrast, the Germans appear to have gone straight to these high voltage fusion neutron tubes. And the US appears to have ultimately adopted those later, many years after the war. So in that respect, this was many years more advanced than what the US was doing. And indeed, if the Germans were doing fusion boosting, if they had enough fusion fuel at the center to increase the explosive yield, that was something that the US did not do until many years after the war. And that boosting could have either made the German wartime bombs much more powerful than the US bombs. So if a US bomb was 20 kilotons, the Germans might have achieved far higher than that with their bombs if they wanted to. Or by improving the efficiency, they potentially could have had smaller bombs, use smaller amounts of fission fuel, and get comparable yields, but from a smaller amount of fuel and a smaller bomb. So really impressively advanced technology. But these German fission bombs were reported by Erich Schumann, by Werner Grothmann, by various sources, consistently as being spherical bombs with a mass, a weight of about 2,000 kilograms. But there was another bomb that was reported in numerous sources in the archives. This bomb was said to have a mass of 6 tons, so far larger. And this appears to have been a true H-bomb, a German H-bomb that was under development. Here's an overview of some of those sources. And across the board, the sources will report that the weight of the bomb was 6 tons. They will report across the board that the expected explosive yield of the bomb was in megatons, as opposed to the kiloton level yields you'd expect for a fission bomb. They report across the board that the bomb used lithium deuteride or similar materials triggered by a fission bomb primary. And several of them report that this bomb was not just a paper drawing, but it was a program in active development, and it was at such an advanced stage. If the war had continued, the Germans were expecting to test their H-bomb later in 1945 or in 1946 at the latest. And they were actually designing delivery vehicles to deliver their bomb, custom delivery to New York, when you care enough to send the very best. These sources also consistently name the same people and places involved in this. And repeatedly, it's AEG, the electrical company I showed you before, and it's a group of scientists in Austria, plus some others. So here's an interview with one of Heinrich Himmler's top adjutants, top assistants. Of course, Himmler was in charge of the SS. One of his top adjutants was Werner Grothmann, and later in life, Werner Grothmann was interviewed and spilled the beans and said, yeah, during the war, we had 3 programs. There was our program to develop a uranium bomb. That went great. There was our program to develop plutonium bombs. That was going well. And we had a 3rd program to develop the hydrogen bomb. And we're expecting that to be ready by 1946 at the latest. And separately in these interviews, he was asked about the design of the bombs. He knew quite a bit from personal experience about the design of the fission implosion bombs. He was less involved with the H-bomb program. So all he could say was it must have looked like a swollen bomb in its design. And that's an intriguing bit of evidence. We'll come back to that later. He says that Himmler was fascinated, was electrified by what the German and Austrian physicists were telling him, that the H-bomb would have an explosive power 100 times greater than that of a fission bomb. And indeed, that is correct. So if a fission bomb has a yield of tens of kilotons, then they're talking about megaton level yields they expect from the German H-bomb. And then adding some confirmation to that, this is a post-war interrogation report on one of Himmler's other adjutants. And this adjutant, says, yes, indeed, Werner Grothmann was indeed the other top adjutant of Himmler. And he reports that Himmler had a board of scientific advisors. So Himmler had 11 people, 11 top scientists reporting to him, giving him advice. And of these 11 scientists, 6 of them were nuclear experts. And the other 5 were earth science experts with expertise that'd be quite relevant if you plan to go setting off nuclear bombs. So all this gives us some idea of what Himmler and the SS had in mind. Here is another post-war interrogation report. This is from somebody that the Soviets captured. And he names some of the same people in this, Gerlach and Tomaszek, as being involved in this German H-bomb program. He names Georg Stetter in Vienna as being a key participant. and says that they were trying to create lithium hydride or lithium deuteride bombs. And we'll come back to Stetter in just a moment. And he says that they had something so powerful that they were worried about exploding their whole experimental facility if it went off. So Georg Stetter was named there. He indeed seems to have been perhaps the central person of this. This may be the person most entitled to be called the father of the H-bomb. So Georg Stetter had been doing nuclear physics at the University of Vienna since the 1920s, and he was surrounded by a very talented group of scientists that he managed and helped there. In 1939, he filed a patent on both fission and fusion reactions and devices. Here's part of that here, talking about fusion, talking about deuterium, tritium, and so forth, results in an explosion of tremendous energy. You can kind of see what he had in mind from the outset. And then throughout the war, Stetter and his colleagues appear to have worked on both fission bombs and fusion bombs. Here are post-war reports that I found in the archives, intelligence reports, and they say that indeed during the war there was work on a German heavy hydrogen bomb, a weapon even more deadly than the atomic bomb. This work was begun by Georg Stetter, working on lithium hydride bombs they planned to set off. Lithium hydride bombs, Georg Stetter, lithium hydride bombs, Georg Stetter, all through these reports confirmed. This is a really fascinating report. Wolfgang Farrant was a scientist who worked both in Austria, so potentially both with people like, surrounded Georg Stetter, and he worked simultaneously for AEG. So he was a linkage between these two. And at the end of the war, he was rounded up by US occupation forces in Austria. And they told him his homework was to sit down and write down what he'd been up to for the last several years. So he sat down, he wrote this up, and bear in mind that what he produced was probably heavily censored by the US, and he was probably heavily censoring himself because he didn't want to get shot. So this is the censored polite version of what he knew, what he was working on. He talks about using lithium dihydride, well suited as the choice of substance, to cause reactions to produce a source of neutrons. The neutrons would produce strong fission reactions in surrounding uranium and liberate large amounts of energy. The lithium dihydride recipient, which may mean the secondary, would be surrounded by a coat of uranium, which may mean the uranium casing. Its goal in all this work was the result in the explosion of the entire lithium deuteride mass, since the reaction zone is capable of enlarging itself on the strength of its own energy production. So creating a self-sustaining and propagating thermonuclear explosive wave in the fuel, exactly as a good H-bomb should do. Again, this was not simply a paper project or a paper concept. Here is another report. This was found by Frank Durbert, one of the researchers I mentioned. This was one of the very first pieces of evidence for this program that was rediscovered in archives. And this was an interrogation report by the Allies, again, of people in Austria. And so they were reporting that they had been working on creating, building, assembling, getting ready to test a, quote, new radioactive bomb weighing 6 tons, which was to be lowered by parachute from a plane. And I think the parachute is a key piece of evidence. So a fission bomb obviously creates a large explosion, but the explosion is not so large that a plane can't get to a safe distance before the bomb goes off. Even a World War II era plane, as happened with Enola Gay and Boxcar and so forth. So you kind of chuck it out the window, it falls to the optimum burst height, and you can fly away in time. But an H-bomb has a much more powerful blast, and it's much harder for a plane to get to a safe distance before that goes off. So if you chuck one of those out the window, you kind of prefer for it to have a parachute on the bomb, so the bomb falls more slowly, you have more time to get away. Here they describe the 6-ton bomb that was radioactive needed a parachute for the plane to get away. It names a number of people involved in this and says that a number of people had been rounded up by these Allied investigators. And one of those was a guy named Edmund Zorg. I'll show you more in a moment. It also says that in July 1944, people affiliated with this whole program were scouting for a test site for this bomb in northern Finland. So if you have a small fission bomb, then sure, there are all kinds of places you can set it off. You know, pick your neighbor's house when they're not home. But if you have a large H bomb, that creates so much destruction, you have to find a good place for it. And so they were scouting for a location in northern Finland. But again, it indicates they were very close to testing this later in 45 or at the latest in 1946. And throughout this, there's mention of people they've rounded up, interrogations, reports they're writing, all of this. But this is all that we have currently. So where are all these other reports that were written? Where are all these interrogation transcripts? They must exist in archives someplace. Here's another one we have from that. As I mentioned, Edmund Zorg was implicated in this. He was promptly rounded up by the powers that be. They threw him into the dustbin Allied Interrogation Center. They asked him what he knew, and his response was, "I know nothing, nothing." So he said that, they wrote that down, but they kept working on him. And so after a couple months, he was a little more compliant and a little more open. And so he admitted that, yes, he actually had been involved in developing this thing. It seems that he was involved on the Luftwaffe end in exactly how the Luftwaffe planes could load and transport and drop something as large as this planned 6-ton bomb. But again, indicating it was close to final testing and use. He also says that both he and his superior, Colonel Peterson, had been extensively interrogated by both the British and the Americans. So these reports, these interrogation transcripts must be in the archives someplace. But all this talk about the 6-ton bomb, here's more talk about a 6-ton bomb. Hans Turing was an Austrian physicist who does not appear to have been directly involved in this program during the war. But after the war, he was sitting around having drinks with somebody who was, and used the information from that to write up a whole book about it. And so he talks about the lithium hydride bomb under development based on this Austrian wartime information. The goal is to produce, in effect, several thousand times as large as before, so megatons instead of kilotons of explosive yield. In fact, he says, God have mercy on the country over which a 6-ton bomb of lithium hydride is made to explode. I have no idea what country they might be talking about here. I'll show you that in a moment. And he also says specifically that the lithium hydride or lithium deuteride would be triggered by a uranium bomb or plutonium bomb as the spark plug or as the primary. All right, so what country could they possibly mean here? Well, I have evidence from the archives of at least 3 different rocket programs to develop rockets capable of carrying a payload specifically listed as 6 tons, no lighter, but 6 tons, and attack on New York, attack on New York, attack on New York. So they were going places. They also had a very good idea of the blast radius of this bomb. So I have repeated reports here that they're expecting a blast radius of 10 kilometers or 6 miles, whether it's given in metric or English in these various reports. It comes from a number of different sources, 21st Army interrogations. This is from the Italian ambassador in Berlin reporting directly in 1944. They're working on something that has a 10-kilometer blast radius. And so if you take this idea of a 10-kilometer blast radius, and if you use your handy nuclear bomb effects computer, never leave home without it, then you find that that corresponds as a very conservative estimate to at least about 1.6 megatons or so. So again, we're talking about something with a megaton yield level that they were expecting. So what was the actual design? We know that the bomb weighed 6 tons. We know that the yield was intended to be megatons. We know that it had a fission trigger. We know that it had lithium deuteride fusion fuel. But what was the actual configuration? And we have less information directly on that. According to the completely unclassified literature, there are two different general categories of H-bomb designs that work. There is something that the Russians called a sloika or layer cake. The Americans called an alarm clock. This is a spherical implosion bomb, but it has multiple concentric layers of alternating fission and fusion fuel. And after the war, Kurt Diebner, who was up to his eyebrows in this stuff, was drawing all kinds of diagrams of lots and lots of concentric layers. So they may have been thinking along these lines. On the other hand, the unclassified sources say that the other possible H-bomb design, the one that we tend to prefer nowadays apparently, 9 out of 10 mad scientists prefer it, is that there is a separate fission bomb primary and separate fission fuel secondary. This is called a two-stage design, sometimes called the Teller-Ulam design. So there's evidence that the Germans may have been considering that. Kurt Diebner had a student named Friedrich Winterberg who came to the US after the war and drew this diagram of a two-stage design. But actually during the war, Walter Gerlach, another scientist involved in this program, was drawing diagrams like this, with the same sort of ellipsoid with two foci for the primary, the secondary, the casing, and right next to it, lots of equations of fusion reactions. So this is straight out of the Deutsches Museum archive in Munich. Again, I come back to what Werner Grothmann, Himmler's assistant, said. He didn't know much about the design of the H-bomb, but he said it must have looked like a swollen bomb. And you could imagine that as applying potentially to either one of these concepts. Now, to produce a lithium deuteride bomb, you have to produce deuterium, you have to produce lithium, and they were getting busy doing that. As I mentioned last time on your program, there's evidence for at least 20 or so plants that were producing heavy water and deuterium all over Europe. There's evidence from archives that the US has all kinds of reports about these plants, but still won't release them. That's not mysterious at all. It's also helpful to have tritium as well as deuterium. And as I showed last time, there's evidence that there may have been some larger production fission reactors, maybe even ones that went into operation. If they were using that heavy water as moderator, they could have produced tritium from the deuterium and heavy water. There's also quite a bit of evidence, which I don't have time to get into here, but in my book, there's a lot of evidence that there was an electronuclear breeding program in wartime Germany. That means using particle accelerators to produce either fission fuel or fusion fuel, and that could have been used to produce tritium as well. They were producing lithium, large amounts of lithium, tons and tons of lithium. Here are post-war documents straight out of the archives documenting how much they were producing. In fact, the Allied investigators were so impressed, they said the use of lithium apparently has progressed further in Germany than the United States. So Germany was very advanced with its lithium production processing capabilities. And this was not just natural lithium, but they were separating lithium into its isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. These are two different natural isotopes of lithium, and lithium-6 is a little preferable for H-bombs. So during the war, Alfred Clem and other scientists had perfected methods of separating lithium-6 from lithium-7. I really can't think of any other major applications for which this would have been suitable. So it kind of gives you an idea of what they were thinking. Here's a wartime report from Clem to Walter Gerlach. Here is a post-war publication. He wrote bragging about his wartime work. And then late in his life, Clem was interviewed by a researcher in Germany, Heiko Petermann. Clem looked very nervous as soon as the interviewer showed up, tried to get rid of the interviewer, but said, yeah, I perfected this whole lithium-6, lithium-7 isotope separation thing in 1942. So there was plenty of time to scale it up potentially during the war. He also admitted that the tritium problem, as he called it, how you produce enough tritium, was well known, and there seems to have been other people, not Clem, who were working on this during the war. More evidence for lithium isotope separation after the war. Many German nuclear scientists went to the Soviet Union. They were immediately put to work essentially reproducing whatever they'd been doing in Germany. And here are documents mentioning several German scientists who were put to work on producing lithium-6 and producing tritium. So Gustav Hertz, Werner Schütze, and Manfred von Ardenne. In fact, von Ardenne won the Stalin Prize because he was so great at purifying lithium-6 for Stalin. So it suggests, but does not prove conclusively, that they were also involved in this wartime lithium-6 production. All right, so let's finish off here. Not only did these German and Austrian nuclear experts seem to do a lot of work during the war in Germany, but after the war, as you saw there, they went to other countries. They appear to have had a large impact on the post-war nuclear programs in other countries, including the United States. So here are some photos. These are from the so-called Paperclip files, the foreign scientist case files at the National Archives. And there were dozens of scientists directly involved in the German nuclear program or with detailed knowledge of the German nuclear program who were brought to the United States to work after the war. For all these scientists, presumably they just weren't hired on the spot. You look like a German scientist, okay, we'll hire you, we'll bring you to the US. There must be interviews, there must be interrogation transcripts, there must be reports for all this. But once they were brought to the US, there must be further reports for what work they were actually doing, what they wrote up. And as far as I can find, these interrogation transcripts, these interrogation reports that they wrote are completely unavailable still for all these people. A lot of those people worked in the German H-bomb program as well as the fission bomb program. Here's a good example. Siegfried Flügge, who I briefly mentioned last time, appears to have been the top theoretical physicist of the German nuclear program. His claim to fame first was in 1939, publishing a paper with detailed calculations of fission bombs and fission reactors. But then during the war, he worked simultaneously for almost every agency and organization in Germany that was working on nuclear bombs. So people think of these as separate programs, but here's the one guy who's working at all these different places. So he's working for the army, he's working for the post office, he's working for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, he's working for the SS, he's working for the Reichsforschungsrat, he's working at Königsberg, which is reported to have a fission reactor in other sources. He's working at the Gusen SS facility, which is another possible fission reactor. So he's kind of the indispensable man working at all these different nuclear sites, nuclear places. So as I mentioned last time, after the war, he was brought to the US at the specific request of Edward Teller. So in 1947, Edward Teller was trying to become the father of the H-bomb, and he was having a little trouble conceiving. And so he wrote this letter, or he had this letter written on his behalf, desperately pleading to have specifically Siegfried Flügge, nobody else, Siegfried Flügge, put on a plane and shipped to the US as quickly as possible. And so the US authorities in Europe did that. They rounded up Siegfried Flügge, they brought him to the US, and he worked in the US at two different points for quite some time prior to the US completing its H-bomb. So Flügge was brought to the US at Teller's insistence to work on that program of great national security importance. When he was not in the US, occasionally wanted to go back to Europe, stretch his feet. So at those times, he was placed on what was called the hot list and constantly monitored by the US Army Counterintelligence Corps, basically the men in black. So they sat on him and they just kind of follow him around everywhere, you know, hang around in his apartment, whatever. So in his files at College Park, I found even letters from Flügge complaining, could you please not have the men in black follow me into the donut shop? It's just embarrassing. So they were just following him around everywhere. And here you can see custodial detention, but they kept doing this until the mid-1950s. Now, even if Flügge were involved in the German fission bomb program, one would think that as soon as the Soviets perfected their own fission bomb in 1949, that then they would say, okay, Flügge doesn't know anything else that the Soviets don't already know, so we can let him go. But they didn't let him go until at least the mid-1950s, after the Soviet Union had perfected their H-bomb, suggesting that Flüge knew an awful lot about the H-bomb, which is why Teller had wanted him. Here's another example. This is Ulrich Jetter. After the war, he published a paper and some books giving details of how H-bombs work. And this appears to have been based on wartime work. He was working with a number of groups during the war, but publishing specifically how you can use lithium deuteride to generate a fusion reaction cycle. And then after the war, he was brought to the United States. Before the US perfected its own H-bomb, he was brought as a cultural exchange fellow to Washington. Somehow I don't think he was brought to Washington to discuss the poetry of Goethe. Another example is Stetter. I mentioned that Stetter may have been the most central figure in all of this. Here is a post-war interrogation report. This is quite interesting. So this report was written by a scientist named Tian Odorenko, who was a very high-ranking physicist at AT&T Bell Labs for many years before the war. He rounded up all kinds of information and brought it back to the US, including Bell Labs, which I think jump-started a lot of research there. But specifically, Odorenko says, I've been talking to this Stetter guy in Austria, and Stetter is currently being imprisoned, confined by US forces, but in an attempt to talk his way out of confinement, Stetter is telling me that if we'll just let him and let his people out of imprisonment and give them back some of their stuff, that they'd be very happy to make an atomic bomb for us, and they could deliver the first one within just a couple months. So very, very interesting information here. This seems to have had the opposite effect to what Stetter intended. So they did not let him out of prison. Instead, they sat on him even harder. Odorenko continued to extract information from Georg Stetter. And it turns out that Stetter and his people around him were so brilliant that in their spare time, in addition to developing fission bombs and H-bombs, in their spare time, they were developing stealth radar-absorbing coatings for vehicles, such as now are used on stealth aircraft by the United States. So this is all duly written up and brought back to the United States and used here. And Stetter and his people had developed the correct modern theory of superconductivity, that electrons work in pairs in superconductors. And so all this was written up, brought back to the United States. And a few decades later, somebody in the United States proudly announced the discovery of this that had been discovered earlier by Georg Stetter and his people. So Stetter and his other researchers never received any credit or payment for any of this. Instead, Stetter was sentenced to house confinement from 1945 until sometime in the 1950s. In fact, he was so tightly confined, they knew he knew so much dangerous stuff, they wouldn't even let him out of the house. They wouldn't even let him go to the library, not even with an escort. So here they're saying they won't even let him go to the library. He had spent his career prior to that working for several decades in nuclear physics, as I showed, just phenomenal track record in nuclear physics, as well as the other things in stealth and superconductivity. He was a scientist. He just had to do science, but he was locked up with this little room with the men in black sitting on him. He had to do science, so he became an expert in dust. I think dust was probably about the only thing he had access to. And so he became the world's leading expert on the science of dust. And he kind of changed careers, and after that was an expert on dust. But there's evidence from these files at College Park that he was closely monitored by the CIC, the Men in Black, again until the mid-1950s, after the Soviet Union had perfected its own H-bomb, and there was nothing that they could have learned from Stetter that they didn't already know. Here's another example from the files. This is another German nuclear physicist, Otto Hoxley. And what he did during the war is quite mysterious. He has a whole paperclip file at NARA, long detailed file, but all the pages in the file have been replaced by National Archives cards saying access restricted, file withdrawn, access restricted, file withdrawn, all these yellow cards. Some other researcher before me tried to find out why this was restricted, what was behind this. So they did a Freedom of Information Act request for his file, for all the pages in his file. And the agency said, sure, we're complying with your Freedom of Information Act request. Here are all of the pages from Otto Hoxley's file, but they had all been completely blanked out. So returned all entirely blank pages. So yes, there's nothing suspicious about this at all. So there's enough evidence that's been found so far from archives to indicate that there was some kind of large and advanced program to develop an H-bomb in Germany during the war, as well as the fission bomb program. We don't really have to speculate about what that might be or wonder what that might be, because it appears from what I've shown you that most of the key players in this program were either interrogated by the US or actually went to work for the US. And so the answers to all this must be in US files. We just have to get these files released. And these files should be able to tell us, all these post-war interrogation transcripts, reports, and things should be able to tell us exactly how far these wartime German nuclear weapons programs got, and exactly how much post-war influence they may have had. As I said, things like using high voltage fusion tubes as neutron initiators in bombs, which the US did not do during the war, but started to do after the war, just like the Germans had been doing during the war. Or H-bombs using lithium deuteride and all this stuff. So how much influence did they have? We don't have to speculate. The answers are already there in the files. We just have to get it released.
Wow. Wow.
So I know I blew through that very quickly, but if people want to see the slides all over again, or see the book with all these archival documents themselves, they can go to my website here, so writerinstitute.org, and you can see more than you ever wanted to see in your life.
Okay, Todd, I thank you very much for that. And I agree, your website has an enormous amount of information. And I appreciate you taking the time to go through it today and present the evidence that you found for the H-bomb program especially. And as mentioned, we would welcome questions for Todd to follow up with on a later program that we plan. So if you want to ask questions, please put them in the comments or get them to me, or obviously there's a method on his website to reach him as well. But we would like to have those questions so we can do a follow-up program with him later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, what struck me, excuse me, a lot of, as you were talking about, particularly the lithium, you know, the lithium work that was going on, is some of the similarities, or at least the parallel work between what was being done in the US. I know, you know, Oak Ridge, for example, there was, you know, lithium work that was done. Of course, Ray can probably go on and on about that, but you know, there was, that would be interesting at some point to look at what are the parallels between what was being done in Germany and what was being done in the US, either at the same time or later. I think
yes, Colex. I believe it was called Colex.
Yeah.
Y12 in the 1950s, 1960s was separating lithium-6, lithium-7 using the mercury process,
yep.
What they call the Colex process. Yes, it would be absolutely fascinating to do a deep dive into the archives and to see if that program was truly an independent post-war invention, or if the origins of that program were information received from some of these German and Austrian scientists from wartime German work on lithium separation.
So let me tell you, the smartest man I ever knew was Dr. John Guggen. John Guggen, G-O-O-G-I-N, is the man that created the Colex, column exchange process at Y12. He was an amazing individual. He's also the one that they showed pictures of Iraq, what was going on in Iraq, and he told them, this is the first Iraq war now, he told them they're building a little Y12 here, here, and here. So they sent rockets in and blew those places up, and then they sent ground troops in later, and they found drawings from Y12 actually in those facilities. So Dr. Guggen created the Colex process at Y12. Whether he had any connection to any of the information you're finding now, I have no evidence to indicate he did.
Mhm.
Not that he would have told me had he done that, but the man had the most intelligence of anyone I have ever met. He could knock you over just by asking you a question. In other words, he could get to the essence of the issue so quick that it would just be astounding. So if you ever find Dr. John Guggen and German scientists connected in a document, I'd sure love to know it.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ryder. We appreciate it. And we look forward to having you back again in the not too distant future. And like Ray said, folks, if you've got a question about any of this, either this presentation or the previous presentation, please, send it to us. You can post it in the comments, either on Facebook or on YouTube, wherever you're watching this. And we'll be able to, we'll compile some questions together and then kind of have a Q&A session with Dr. Ryder at a later date. So, Ray, who do we have coming up next?
Well, the next one that's scheduled is Jim Dodson. Jim is a city councilman for the city of Oak Ridge, and he's also an art teacher at the Jefferson Middle School. He's been influential in getting some of the art sculptures that are around Oak Ridge and also the murals that have been painted there. He and I are going to be dedicating a historical marker from the Tennessee Historical Commission at the large outdoor pool. And he's also on the board of the AMSI Foundation and also the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association. So we will be interested in letting Jim talk about his perspective on history and Oak Ridge and what he sees, not only for what we're doing now and in the recent past, but possibly he can help us to understand some of the things that's being accomplished and looking forward a little bit as to what the city council is doing regarding the historical significance of activities and things in Oak Ridge. So look forward to him on board.
Jim is a good friend to many people, to me included. And to say that Jim Dodson is an art teacher is kind of like saying Warren Buffett is a businessman. It's true.
I got it.
He's so much more. He is so much more than an art teacher and has so many things for so many people. So
he's involved in the arts, not only in Oak Ridge, but in the Knoxville, East Tennessee and the state area. So he's heavily involved in the arts.
He is. All right. Well, that sounds good. And that'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. And that sounds great. All right, Ray, anything else?
No, that's it. And thanks again to Todd.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ryder. We appreciate it. And folks, thank you for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.